So, with the Superman trailer coming out this week, what better way to celebrate than the story where Superman becomes Batman? And I don't mean like, what is it, Batman the Animated Series or Superman the Animated Series, where Superman temporarily becomes Batman. I mean, like, he's Batman. And it's pretty dope. So, this is an Elseworlds story called Speeding Bullets, written by J.M.D. DeMatteis. And what this does is this initially picks up with like the origin of Superman as you would expect, right? Coming from the planet of Krypton, the planet explodes, all the stuff that we know, right, in the public consciousness. The difference here is that when his ship arrives on Earth, it crash lands in front of Thomas and Martha Wayne, who never had Bruce. And of course, much like we saw when it came to Martha and Jonathan with the traditional Superman mythos, they end up adopting him. Now, because of the resources of the Wayne family, they don't really take up residence in the city of Gotham proper. They kind of live outside of Gotham the way the Wayne Manor normally resides. And Martha very much looks at Superman as her own son. And of course, again, because he's adopted by the Waynes, he gets the name Bruce. Of course, Thomas looks at him as, yes, it's his son, but there's almost a kind of distance between them, right? Not the same kind of loving relationship that he has with his mother. Now, I don't mean to say that he and his father were estranged or anything like that, right? It's not like Thomas didn't care about him at all, but there was just something about Bruce that they couldn't quite put their finger on. And this is where the origin between Superman as we know him and Superman in this story really begin to differ. Because as most of you guys know, whether you read Jeff Johns' Superman Secret Origin or you're just familiar with the character, Superman's powers started to manifest at about this time in his life when he was very, very young. And ultimately he ended up talking to his father, Jonathan, who gave him, a few pearls of wisdom here and there. And there were characters like Lana Lang that were able to help him along the way in harnessing his powers. With this, there really isn't anybody there to do that. And it's because his powers have not kicked in. They haven't really activated in any meaningful way. But this starts to happen with the death of Thomas and Martha after coming out of seeing the Zorro film, which of course this takes place years after he was adopted. That's one of the things I want to specify. There are time skips here over the course of the story. Joe Chill runs up on the family and Joe Chill shoots Thomas and Martha. Now, Superman at this point loses it. And in fact, instead of Bruce Wayne, when he just kind of sat there and cried because what else was he supposed to do? The heat vision of Superman activates. And when it does, in his tears, he blasts Joe Chill and kills the guy. But at that point, he's just kind of like, I don't know what to do, right? He has no clue what's going on. So he just kind of sits there and he cries. Even when the cops show up and when Alfred shows up to collect him, and it's just kind of like he was just sitting there, just saying over and over again, the bullets, the bullets, the bullets. What this does is it shifts Superman away from being the traditional good guy Superman that we know to very much of a Bruce Wayne character. And it's kind of interesting the way that it's done because he just sort of mulls over everything that happens because in the moment, he doesn't really know what he's supposed to do. He knows that he has heat vision. And as the years pass and time goes on, you don't really see any indication that he has like super hearing or anything along those lines. All that kind of stuff seems to come later. Instead, he is completely and totally immersed by the death of his parents and the guilt that he felt in his younger years, that over time he kind of compartmentalized and pushed away and doesn't really feel the same way anymore. Instead, all that really happens here is he looks at these newspaper clippings, right? Lex Luthor, for example, coming to Gotham City about a year after a near fatal accident at one of the plants that he has. But what Superman does here, I guess Bruce, we can just kind of call him that, what he does here is he takes all these little newspaper clippings and he puts them up in a room. Now, it is almost a kind of self-torture to a degree, because with the idea of his parents being killed in a senseless crime, and with all these senseless crimes taking place out there, and him feeling so powerless, he's kind of a person who just surrounds himself with all these problems, none of which he can fix, and then sits around complaining about the problems that he cannot fix, right? It is self-imposed misery. That's really all it is here. And the reality here is that it stems from a kind of self-punishment, right? For reasons that he doesn't fully understand on the conscious level. That as a kind of punishment for the fact that he never saved his parents, he just constantly beats himself over the head with these various miserable circumstances, families being slain, different things along those lines. And so what ends up happening is there's a couple of burglars that break into the house, right, of Bruce. And initially they seem to want to rob him or something along those lines. But then he starts to get angry, right? He starts calling them animals, right? Calling them these murdering type of people. And then he grabs one of them and throws him out the window. And then when the other guy opens fire, he tells him, "You cannot kill me. The bullets cannot hurt me. Nothing can hurt me." And then like goes to grab this guy, crushes the gun, and then intends to completely incinerate him with his heat vision the same way he did with Joe Chill, but then ultimately doesn't, right? Like he looks away and kind of blasts his heat vision into the fire. But Alfred watches all of this because what Alfred sees is Bruce losing control, that Bruce has these incredible abilities, but seemingly he just kind of allows his guilt and his misery to get the better of him. And that's when this whole scenario kind of comes pouring back in this moment of sadness and misery when the heat vision seemingly manifests for the second time in his entire life, and all the memories come flooding back in. The death of his parents, the fact that he should have done something, that he could have done something. Now, as miserable as this may seem, this is actually the first step in the healing process, right? Like coming to grips with his own past and his own trauma. And so what he does is he starts asking the question, what am I? Why do I have things like heat vision? What's the whole motivation behind this? Now, what's so interesting about this story is that one shift in circumstance, and it's very easy to see how Superman could become a Bruce Wayne type character. The big difference between Superman and Batman is their upbringing, right? Superman was raised in a small town out in Kansas with some down-to-earth parents, and that they taught him this moral compass that was really rooted in what it meant to like work for a living and to value the decency and kindness that human beings bring to the world. Whereas Batman had an almost kind of disconnected upbringing, right? Like, sure, his parents taught him like you should do things for the world, but there's a difference between being taught how bad people have it and actually struggling out there in the world, right? As Immanuel Kant would say, knowledge through experience is the only real knowledge. And so when you have Superman, whose parents, for the most part, lived pretty healthy lives. Of course, Jonathan ended up passing away, and then eventually Martha passed away as well. But you have Batman, whose parents were taken from him in a very violent crime. You switch these two characters, where Superman's thrust into the death of his parents at the hands of Joe Chill in Crime Alley. It's no wonder that he ends up becoming the person that he is. And so as he starts to explore and starts to look into his own past, there really isn't a lot of indication that he gets a kind of full-on explanation of it all. Like, for example, he never goes to create the Fortress of Solitude. He never communicates with Jor-El, his father, or anything along those lines. So he's just kind of left out there in the world to figure things out on his own devices. Things like telescopic vision and X-ray vision kick in. He's able to see the bats up in the cave, and he starts flying around with the bats. And that's when the idea comes to him, I can become Batman, right? I know myself at last. And so one of the things that goes on here is that you switch over to these criminals who were basically trying to break into the house of Superman, only to find out that they had seemingly been contracted by the Joker. Now, of course, the Joker kills these guys, and we don't really know what the motivation is with him attacking Bruce Wayne, outside of the fact that it's like the Joker, right? You know, Batman and the Joker are always going back and forth. But there is a really cool revelation with the Joker's character. But one of the things that goes on here is you pick up 2 months after all of this, and you have this guy on a rooftop, right, who's basically just kind of losing his mind and taking shots and so on and so forth. And that's when Superman appears as Batman for the very first time. Now, because this, again, is like a 50 some odd page one shot, there's a lot of fast tracking here, right? If this was like a 6-issue miniseries, it would be a lot more developed, right? And a lot more fleshed out. Instead, it's just like he was flying with the bats, then he became Batman, then he does some stuff. Thanks for watching, guys. Peace. Like, that's kind of the nature of the story. And so once he actually becomes Batman, this guy starts firing shots. But one of the big differences between Superman as Batman and Bruce Wayne as Batman is Superman hides his entire face. And in fact, when this guy opens fire on him, of course, the bullets bounce off. He assumes that, you know, Batman is wearing some kind of flak jacket. So like he throws a grenade at him, and then the grenade is caught and the grenade just kind of explodes in his hand. And that's basically it. But then you get a kind of difference here where this guy gets thrown over the building. Now, initially, Superman just kind of lets it happen, which, by the way, we'll kind of bounce back and forth between Superman, Batman. It's all kind of the same thing. But Superman just kind of like lets this guy fall. the cops are the ones who rescue him. So it's one of these things where it's just kind of like, okay, like this is kind of a darker version of Superman than we're traditionally used to. Now, of course, this leads to him just kind of busting in on this meeting between Lex Luthor, who's essentially trying to take over Wayne Industries, and ultimately, of course, it doesn't happen, right? It's really Bruce Wayne walking in there and saying, like, I never gave permission for this to happen. That's not going to happen at all, right? Like, there's no way this company is being sold out from under me. So he ends up firing his entire firm. Lex Luthor leaves with nothing whatsoever, and quite literally, as a villain of the week kind of character would do, shakes his fist angrily in the air and is like, you haven't heard the last of me. So it's a little hokey, but it is kind of interesting to see at the same time, because at that point, you switch over to Wayne actually going to the Gotham Gazette and seemingly being a part of the Gotham Gazette. But one of the things that had happened here is that Lois Lane had left the Daily Planet in Metropolis and had come over here, which one really has to ask the question, why would somebody willingly move to Gotham City? No one goes to Gotham City on purpose. They end up there because they were traveling through and they lost all their money and now they can't leave, right? No one goes to Gotham City on purpose. It's kind of weird. But as Lois Lane is leaving, which of course, as you would expect, Bruce is just totally smitten with Lois Lane, that as she's leaving, she's picked up by Lex Luthor. And while both of their journeys had kind of led them to this place, Lex Luthor starts to put the moves on her, both literally and figuratively. Like where he goes to touch her and she's like slaps him across his face and is just like, do not ever put your hands on me. But it's also one of those things where he tries to bring her in and have her work directly for him. Now, when it comes to Lois Lane, there's a couple reasons for this. I mean, number one, right? I mean, she's a tall drink of water. What are you going to say? She's not that bad looking. But number two, she's an incredibly capable investigative journalist. If she decided to take her skills and use them against Lex Luthor, it's going to make all kinds of problems for him. But if she can work for him, then suddenly she can start digging up dirt on all the people that he needs, and so on and so forth. Almost kind of becomes this like J. Edgar Hoover type character. Ultimately, she ends up rejecting the offer, and so he just kind of says, you're meant for the streets, throws her out of the car 50 blocks away from her apartment, and then just drives off from what's basically the crappy part of Gotham City, which leads to her being set on by a few of these guys who, of course, intend to do some pretty heinous things to her. But then Superman shows up, right, as Batman, and where he goes to save her life, and you would expect her to be grateful for it because of the hyper violence of how he acts, and because of the fact that it confirms the violence, or at least the violent stories that Lois Lane has heard about up to this point. She's totally like repulsed by him. She doesn't want to have anything to do with him, right? He's just like, let me help you. She just slaps his hand away. She's like, get away from me. And so ultimately he ends up taking off. And she kind of is in the midst of writing this paper to a degree and is just sort of like, is this really what the city has come to? Is this really where this city is now? That like, we put our trust in the hands of a crazed vigilante who has incredible power and is abusive in terms of how he uses it, right? That is not something to aspire to. But what's also so ironic and is kind of a flip from the way things traditionally were is that she's totally smitten with Bruce Wayne. And again, like when you look at the old Superman comics, kind of the cornerstone of the way his character was written back in the 30s and the 40s, right? From Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, Superman was smitten over Lois Lane. Lois Lane didn't want to really have anything to do with Clark, but she loved Superman, right? She was all about Superman. So here again, it's kind of the inverse, and the two of them share a romantic, moment with each other. But it's really more the fact that she's interested in his idealism, right? His dedication to the way that he uses his wealth for the city of Gotham. So again, it's really more attracted to the nature of him as a hero, albeit the non-powered version of him. And so what ends up happening following that, right, as quote unquote time passes, which is the best bit that we get as far as, these time skips, is Lex Luthor comes busting in, right? So like the whole Gazette and just like invades, Superman, or I guess, Bruce Wayne's office and just kind of starts spouting off at the mouth. But one of the things that he does is he says, I told you guys after that whole explosion that I'm a whole new man. Well, let me show you how new of a man I am. And then he takes his mask off and you find out Lex Luthor is the Joker in this story, which is kind of nuts because he immediately attacks Superman, grabs Lois, and then literally flies away with a helicopter on his back, like just a propeller attached to his back, which, as goofy as it seems, is kind of dope, to be honest with you guys. Like, if I'm being quite frank, it is kind of cool. But because of the fact that he's allowing his insane side to come out, he just kind of starts babbling to Lois Lane about how he wants to kind of restructure Gotham into the city that he imagines it being. That Metropolis is too shiny and clean, and that here in Gotham, he can be himself. And that Lois Lane is going to be his queen, right? In this kingdom that the two of them are going to rule. Very much just like the ravings of a madman is really all it is. Kind of what you would expect from the Joker if it was Lex Luthor being the Joker. Now, of course, Superman shows up here and Superman confronts him. But one of the things that's happening where Joker taunts him is like, you have no real idea what's going on in the city because you're not paying attention. The revolution is going on. And Superman starts looking around and paying attention to Gotham and realizing it's exactly that. That what Lex Luthor did is he flooded the streets of Gotham with various arms and armament, giving them to really anybody. Mercenaries that he could hire, criminals who were just out for doing bad things, and that's it. And they're all taking it to the cops. It's a complete and total madhouse out there. And Lex just laughs about it, right? I mean, literally, Batman's like, why are you doing this? And Lex like, I mean, why not? That's really, I mean, why not do it? Right? And so, like, ultimately, he just kind of gets fed up, right? He's like, I can hear them, hundreds of them all across the city, suffering in agony because of you. And he grabs Lex and goes to throw him into the ground. And then, like, as he does that, he sees Lois, who's watching all this unfold, and she's just like, no, right? Like, don't do that. And so, of course, Superman swoops down, grabs Lex Luthor, and then just like takes him off to jail. Now, he is shot by like a tank in an attempt to like stop him. Of course, he uses his heat vision and destroys the tanks and everything. Doesn't really kill the guys. Instead, he just kind of deals with them and all the other henchmen using non-violent means, kind of following the ideologies of Lois. And that's one of the things he says. For so many years, Batman had hidden his pain, right? Denying the wounded little boy who'd watched traumatized and helpless while his parents were murdered. That's who the Batman was. A child in a Halloween costume playing out a lifetime of guilt and anger. And his vision was as narrow as a child's, focused on one goal: punishing the bad man who'd taken his mother and father away. But the time had finally come for him to realize that in scaling down his vision, he'd scaled his own soul. Now, again, there are some really cool and impactful philosophical ideologies in the story. The problem is that the plot is absolute nonsense. And so it just kind of overshadows everything else that J. M. DeMatteis was really kind of discussing and talking about that could have been more meaningful. But what ends up happening is Superman goes to meet with Lois, right? And she was like, you did everything that I was hoping that you would do, right? That you didn't use your power to punish people. You used your powers for great things. That with your power, there's so much more that you can do. Instead of flexing your muscles, stooping to the level of the very people that you're trying to stop, you can rise above all of that and stand as an example, a symbol of hope. And that's where Lois is, and that's where he says, I don't have it in me to do that, to be that way. And Lois is like, the Batman doesn't, but Bruce Wayne does. Of course, Lois figured out quite readily that Bruce Wayne is Batman. And you would expect her to. I mean, it's Lois Lane. She'd figure it out like that, an absolute quickness. And so ultimately they just kind of take off, right? Where I assume he just takes her on a little bit of a trip and shows her the world, and they probably touch naughty bits. But then like the story ends with him swooping back down through the sky in the daytime as Superman. Not really the traditional Superman outfit that you see. I mean, he's got the face thing, which is kind of wonky, but he ends up becoming the Superman that we all know and love at the end of the story. So let me know what you guys think about this. Is it a descent into complete and total madness? Yes, and it is by no means DeMatteis' best work. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.